During the 1990s, Daewoo, one of the world's largest conglomerates at its height, came to symbolize both the promise and peril of unchecked corporate expansion, boasting more than 320,000 employees and 590 overseas subsidiaries operating in over 110 countries, while its management attracted widespread praise and academic accolades, appearing to represent a Korean success story on the global stage. However, by the end of the decade, this former pinnacle of the business world would crumble to dust amid the exposure of a $15.3 billion accounting fraud scandal that was labeled as the biggest in history, with the collapse of Daewoo having since become a case study in the dangers of weak corporate governance, offering one of the earliest signs of regulatory failures that would later haunt major corporations around the world. The Daewoo Corporation came into existence during 1967, when 30-year-old Woo Choong Kim founded Daewoo Industrial in Seoul as a modest textile exporter, launching the company with just 5 employees and an initial capital of $18,000, with the name Daewoo having been drawn from the Chinese characters meaning Great Universe. Kim's desire was to prove that South Korea, then still recovering from war and economic hardship, could produce a global industrial powerhouse, and by 1972, Daewoo had already become the country's second-largest exporter, signaling its emergence as a serious player in South Korea's manufacturing landscape, being listed on the Korea Stock Exchange a year later, which opened new avenues for capital and greatly accelerated its growth trajectory. By 1979, Daewoo had overtaken rivals to become South Korea's leading exporter, fully aligning itself with the government's push for export-driven industrialization under the economic blueprint known as the Miracle on the Han River, with Daewoo developing a distinctive strategy centered around the acquisition and rehabilitation of failing enterprises. This approach set it apart from other businesses, which often focused on organic growth or internal development, and in 1976, Daewoo acquired Hankook Machinery Limited, a major manufacturer of rolling stock, industrial machinery and diesel engines, which had suffered 38 consecutive years of financial losses, this move facing strong opposition from within Daewoo's senior management, but Kim insisted on the purchase, believing he could revitalize the ailing company. Renamed Daewoo Heavy Industries, it turned a profit within its first year under Daewoo's ownership, and 2 years later in 1978, Daewoo acquired the failing Okpo shipbuilding company, with this shipyard, which was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, being integrated into Daewoo Heavy Industries, and returned to profitability by 1983, thus cementing Daewoo's reputation as a turnaround specialist and highlighted Kim's appetite for risk. Daewoo's ambition did not stop at the Korean border, as unlike many of its domestic rivals, the company embraced an outward-looking business model from early on, with Kim believing that international expansion was essential for long-term growth, particularly in a nation with a relatively small domestic market. In 1993, Daewoo formalized its international ambitions through the Global Management Strategy, a comprehensive plan to boost overseas operations, pouring resources into establishing a global network and launching new ventures across the Americas, Europe, Africa and Asia, and by 1998, it had set up more than 590 overseas subsidiaries operating in 110 countries, in addition to 31 domestic firms, while its workforce swelled to over 320,000 employees globally. Daewoo would become one of the few South Korean firms to venture into politically unstable or diplomatically isolated regions, with one of its boldest moves being when it invested in North Korea, which proved to be an extraordinary step at the time, when the two Koreas remained officially at war, with Kim becoming the first South Korean business leader to visit Pyongyang and negotiated directly with northern officials to establish business ties. This aggressive expansion drew both admiration and criticism, as while Daewoo was praised for its boldness, many analysts argued that its success was underpinned not by superior innovation or efficiency, but by its ability to extract financial and regulatory concessions from the state, with the group having mastered the art of rent-seeking, leveraging its perceived importance to the national economy to obtain support. This dynamic became particularly evident in 1988, when Daewoo Shipbuilding and Heavy Machinery, a newly merged entity, faced collapse under a debt burden of 1.2 trillion won, or roughly $1.8 billion, amid deteriorating global market conditions, with critics arguing that it should have been allowed to fail under normal market rules, but the government, fearing economic contagion, intervened in 1989 with a 400 billion won bailout. Much of the influence businesses like this had over the South Korean government came through the chaebol business model, which had been established during the 1960s and 70s as part of the massive effort to revitalize the country from a war-torn agrarian society into a modern industrial economy, with the state handpicking a small number of entrepreneurial families to lead the charge. These families formed the basis of what would become the chaebols, sprawling family-controlled business empires that were tasked with executing the state's industrial policy, for which they would receive an arsenal of support in the form of preferential access to credit through state-owned banks, tax benefits, tariff protections, and near-total monopoly rights in strategic industries such as steel, shipbuilding, electronics, and chemicals. These partnerships were built on performance and loyalty rather than on market discipline, with the result being the creation of a corporate governance structure that subordinated traditional checks and balances in favor of state-guided control and family dominance. Within this environment, the chaebols developed management cultures that were rigid, autocratic, and deeply patriarchal, with the founders, who were overwhelmingly male, installing themselves as chairmen and maintained ironclad control over decision-making, with their authority extending across hundreds of affiliated companies, often regardless of sector or geography. Although boards of directors, external auditors, and legal compliance bodies formally existed, they rarely functioned independently, with decisions being passed down from the top with minimal scrutiny or debate, this being compounded by a society where dissent was discouraged and job mobility was limited, leaving executives and employees with no recourse but to comply, while career advancement hinged on personal loyalty to the chairman rather than merit or competence, and retaliation for insubordination was swift, and the risks of challenging authority were too great for most to contemplate. Ostensibly, the government sought to challenge the influence of the chaebols, as per the 1972 Company Listing Promotion Act, in which chaebols were strongly encouraged, and in many cases forced, to list their major subsidiaries on the stock exchange, the intention being to democratize economic wealth by broadening share ownership, and to infuse the capital markets with liquidity and institutional credibility. However, the listing process was carefully managed to ensure that it did not weaken the grip of the founding families, and to placate their fears, the government offered protections that limited shareholder rights, diluted board accountability, and insulated family control from external threats, thus creating a peculiar arrangement in which ownership was dispersed, yet power remained highly concentrated. Over time, this system produced a sharp divergence between control rights and cash flow rights, with the families retaining control through circular shareholding structures, or subsidiaries owning shares in each other, while progressively diluting their economic exposure through rights offerings and share sales, thus allowing them to dominate corporate affairs with only a fraction of the financial stake that might be expected. This also gave rise to serious agency conflicts, with controlling families having both the incentive and the ability to pursue strategies that benefited themselves, even at the expense of minority shareholders, creditors, and the long-term health of the business, these governance flaws being compounded by the practice of intra-group support, a central feature of chaebol operations. When an affiliate struggled, others were expected to step in with cash infusions, debt guarantees, favourable contracts, or asset transfers, with this culture of mutual assistance being not merely tolerated, but was often required by state guidance, with banks acting as agents of industrial policy, issuing loans to riskier affiliates, on the condition that stronger ones provided guarantees. Regulators looked the other way, believing that the collective strength of the group would prevail, though in practice, this approach blurred accountability and obscured financial risk, while at the same time encouraging moral hazard, distorting resource allocation, and rewarding underperformance. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the consequence of this model began to surface, with chaebol chairmen, having grown accustomed to impunity, becoming entangled in major corruption scandals, with one of the most notorious cases involving Woo Choong Kim of Daewoo and other leading chairmen, who were found to have funneled more than 510 billion won in bribes to Presidents Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo. These payments, framed as obligatory contributions to slush funds, were said to be in exchange for favours such as government contracts, regulatory waivers, and continued preferential treatment, and while courts later issued suspended sentences on the grounds of the chairman's economic contributions, the episode revealed the extent of political patronage embedded in Korean business. Meanwhile, the financial architecture of the chaebols rested on an increasingly precarious foundation, with debt financing, encouraged during Korea's high-growth years, becoming a structural dependency, and while chaebols took on massive liabilities far exceeding their equity, the subsidiaries would routinely guarantee each other's loans, and chairmen personally guaranteed corporate debt to satisfy bank requirements. However, the outcome of these interconnected guarantees made the financial system acutely vulnerable, and if one company defaulted, a cascading series of obligations could be triggered, threatening the entire group, though investors, lenders, and regulators continued to operate under the assumption that the state would never let a major chaebol fail. This, therefore, reinforced the belief that Daewoo, like other chaebols, was simply too big to fail, while also signalling the government's reluctance to enforce market discipline, creating a dangerous precedent. And encouraged by this implicit safety net, chaebols, including Daewoo, began taking increasingly reckless financial risks, further entrenching systemic vulnerabilities. Of all the chaebol fiefdoms, Woo Choong Kim's grip over Daewoo was by far the most notorious, making all strategic decisions, handpicking senior executives, and setting the company's tone and culture, his management strategy being tireless, and he would reportedly spend over 260 days a year traveling to oversee operations across the globe. His business style was aggressive, pragmatic, and relentless, a trait he had carried over since he was a boy delivering newspapers in post-war Korea, wherein to save time on delivering papers and collecting money at the same time, he would deliver the papers in one single round, and then return afterwards to collect the payment, his abiding philosophy being that the gains in speed and volume more than compensated for the occasional loss. Kim had also benefited from his personal connection with President Park Chung-hee, who ruled South Korea from 1961 until his assassination in 1979, with Park having held Kim in such high regard due to Kim's father having once been one of his teachers, with this personal link offering Daewoo preferential access to state contracts and favourable treatment under Park's heavy-handed industrial policy. While the chaebols had a head start, Daewoo's rise under Park's administration was meteoric, and Kim adeptly exploited the corporate governance framework of the time, which prioritised national interests over shareholder rights, and he was able to secure government backing in key acquisitions, while also using strategic donations, such as transferring his personal Daewoo shares to the Daewoo Foundation in 1981 to bolster political goodwill. As per the 1988 bribery scandal, Kim utilised his connections to the corridors of power to help him escape legal consequences, and at one point he even considered entering politics himself, and seriously entertained the idea of running for president in 1992, using his connections within the South Korean government to help further his cause, though he ultimately never pursued this direction formally. Regardless, international recognition followed, and in 1984 he received the International Chamber of Commerce's International Business Award as presented by King Carl Gustaf XVI of Sweden, while in 1994 Kim published his autobiography, Every Street is Paved with Gold, which became an international bestseller with more than 2 million copies sold and translations in 21 languages. This book would encapsulate his core business philosophy, emphasizing vision, persistence, and internationalism, and by February 1999, Kim had reached the peak of his corporate influence when he was elected president of the Federation of Korean Industries, the country's most powerful business organization. However, the seeds that would sow Kim's ultimate downfall came 2 decades earlier in 1978, when Daewoo took its first step into the automotive sector by acquiring a 50% stake in Seihan Motor, entering into a joint venture with General Motors Korea, this move being consistent with Daewoo's established strategy of acquiring struggling companies and transforming them into viable businesses, while simultaneously pushing its export-driven growth model. The acquisition was presented as a bold but logical extension of Daewoo's ambitions, aligning with the government's desire to foster national champions capable of competing globally, though this foray would later prove to be one of the group's most costly and strategically misguided decisions. Instead of building a competitive edge through innovation, quality, or efficiency, Daewoo Motor focused obsessively on scale, with its overriding objective being to capture global market share, even at the expense of profitability and product development, with the company underinvesting in research and design, neglecting product differentiation, and relying heavily on outdated platforms and technologies. While rivals such as Hyundai began improving their engineering capabilities and streamlining operations, Daewoo chased growth by spreading itself thin across multiple markets with limited local adaptation, and while their vehicles were affordable, they often failed to meet consumer expectations in terms of reliability and after-sales service, eroding brand loyalty over time. By 1988, a decade after entering the automotive market, Daewoo was already the most indebted conglomerate in South Korea, with borrowings exceeding $11.2 billion, its debt-to-equity ratio vastly surpassing industry norms, reflecting an ingrained dependence on cheap credit from government-backed banks. And while this kind of financial leverage was common among chaebols at the time, Daewoo pushed this to the furthest extremes. Over the years, it formalized this approach through what was termed the 100th strategy, in which Daewoo claimed it needed to contribute only 1% of a project's capital outlay, while the rest would be financed through a complex web of foreign loans, cross-affiliate guarantees, equity partnerships with local investors, and other forms of indirect financing. In 1991, Daewoo deepened its automotive commitment by acquiring GM's remaining 50% stake in Daewoo Motor, with this move further entrenching Daewoo in an industry that demanded long-term investment, high capital expenditure, and technical competence, areas where the conglomerate was weakest. Rather than consolidating and strengthening its domestic operations, Daewoo opted for aggressive and poorly planned international expansion, with 1994 seeing it purchase the Worthing Technical Centre in the United Kingdom to bolster its design and engineering credentials, while during that same year, it entered the Romanian market by establishing the Rode joint venture for $300 million and later setting its sights on Central and Eastern Europe, regions viewed as emerging markets ripe for industrial development. By 1996, Daewoo had entered Poland through a $1.1 billion acquisition of FSO, this being quickly followed by the $700 million purchase of a truck plant in southern Poland and the $200 million acquisition of the Czech truck maker Avia, while further investments included Uzbekistan's Uz car plant and partnership arrangements with automotive firms in Ukraine and India. Each of these ventures demanded heavy capital expenditure, and most generated minimal returns, with Daewoo's lack of focus on integration and operational efficiency, meaning these newly acquired plants struggled with inconsistent supply chains, poor quality control, and failure to meet local market needs. By early 1998, just as the Asian financial crisis was reaching its peak, Daewoo had added 14 new vehicle production facilities across 13 countries, and in January of that year, the company completed the acquisition of a controlling 51.98% stake in SsangYong Motor, with this acquisition, one of the largest during the crisis, being widely criticized as reckless and emblematic of Daewoo's hubris. SsangYong was already financially fragile, and integrating it into an overstretched global structure proved untenable, with the purchase not only draining Daewoo's remaining liquidity, but also signaling to creditors and investors that the conglomerate was in denial about its financial limits. The strain was further exacerbated by Daewoo Corporation's structural weaknesses, as with it being the de facto holding company, it did not generate substantial profits itself, but served primarily as a trading and financial intermediary, lacking the capital reserves to support weaker affiliates during downturns, and instead functioning as a financial conduit, orchestrating a complex system of offshore subsidiaries and internal lending. These mechanisms were later used to hide losses and manipulate balance sheets, allowing the group to maintain the illusion of solvency long after it had become structurally unstable. But despite mounting warnings, Daewoo continued to operate as if its expansion model remained viable, and by 1998, the company's debt-gearing ratio had surpassed 2,000%, with investors responding with increasing skepticism. In April 1997, Daewoo's price-to-book ratio stood at 1-to-1, the lowest among Korea's major conglomerates, which averaged above 2, with the company also facing significantly higher borrowing costs, with interest rates 2.6% above those of its peers, while the bond yield spread between Daewoo and other chaebols widened from 1% in 1998 to between 2 and 3% by early 1999, but even these figures failed to capture the full risk exposure, as they were based on financial statements that concealed the extent of Daewoo's insolvency through fraudulent accounting and concealed debts. However, the perceived invulnerability of the chaebols took a devastating blow during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which began in Thailand with the collapse of the Thai baht, and quickly spread to much of East and Southeast Asia, the crisis having been triggered by speculative attacks and the abandonment of fixed exchange rates, thus exposing deep weaknesses in regional financial systems, particularly in Thailand, Indonesia and South Korea. Over-leveraging, short-term foreign debt, crony-capitalism, weak corporate governance and heavy dependence on US dollar-pegged currencies created a fragile financial environment, and as global capital rapidly fled the region, currencies crashed, stock markets plummeted, and private debt soared. Governments responded by raising interest rates and intervening in currency markets, but their foreign reserves were insufficient to stop the collapse, with the International Monetary Fund intervening with large bailout packages for the worst-hit economies, demanding structural reforms, high interest rates, and fiscal austerity as conditions, and though these were intended to restore confidence, these measures often worsened domestic economic pain, leading to political upheaval and government collapses, as per the 31-year reign of Indonesian dictator Suharto. As a result of the crisis, the capital flight, currency devaluation and investor panic left many Korean firms exposed as over-leveraged and undercapitalized, with April 1998 seeing the Financial Supervisory Commission signal that the 5 largest chaebols would be allowed to restructure themselves, while smaller ones would be subject to state-directed workout programs. This move only cemented the notion that the largest chaebols occupied a privileged tier in the economy, with investors continuing to pour funds into chaebols despite mounting signs of distress, convinced they were effectively backed by the full faith and credit of the state. At an operational level, Chaebol presented themselves as integrated service providers capable of executing complex multi-sectoral projects, though in practice, this meant that when a new hotel, plant or infrastructure project was undertaken, a dozen or more affiliates were involved, from construction to logistics, financing, marketing and aftercare. While this package approach had some benefits in coordination and speed, it also made the groups more fragile, with a failure in one affiliate having the potential to ripple through the rest, especially if debt or operational risks were shared, though regardless, this model was cited as a justification for keeping failing affiliates alive, reinforcing the too-big-to-fail narrative. The opacity of the Chaebol's financial records only added to the risk, with many being engaged in earnings management to meet internal and external expectations, while regulatory authorities, eager to attract foreign investment and sustain economic growth, often turned a blind eye to creative accounting practices, and without the requirement for consolidated statements, companies could engage in circular transactions that artificially boosted sales and masked losses. As such, a single asset might be sold from one affiliate to another at inflated prices, creating the illusion of group-wide profitability, with this manipulation not only being permitted but actively rewarded in the form of government contracts, loans and regulatory favours, while investors, both foreign and domestic, had access to balance sheets that, while legal on paper, bore little resemblance to economic reality. The devastating reality of how fragile the Chaebols were came to light when, at the end of 1997, the Korean won, which had traded steadily at around 900 per US dollar, depreciated rapidly, bottoming out at nearly 2,000 within 4 months, while foreign capital exited en masse, credit markets froze, and confidence in the region's so-called economic miracle evaporated almost overnight. To prevent total collapse, South Korea was forced to accept an unprecedented $58 billion bailout package orchestrated by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank, which in return would see the IMF impose severe austerity measures, including interest rate hikes above 30% and sweeping financial liberalization, choking liquidity, worsening corporate debt burdens, and contributing to an economic contraction of 6.9% in 1998, the sharpest in the country's post-war history. It was in this hostile environment that the Daewoo Group chose to make a defiant gamble, as while other conglomerates scrambled to reduce exposure, shed assets and preserve liquidity, Daewoo moved in the opposite direction, instead reverting to the familiar formula of expansion in the face of adversity, with Kim framing the crisis not as a threat, but as a rare window to acquire distressed assets cheaply, outmaneuver rivals, and position Daewoo for long-term dominance. At the heart of this expansionist push was the automotive sector, which Kim had long viewed as Daewoo's global flagship despite its chronic losses and massive capital demands, with January 1998 seeing Daewoo Motor acquire SsangYong Motor in one of the most ill-timed transactions in Korean corporate history, bringing aboard 3.4 trillion won in new liabilities at a time when financing costs were spiraling and currency volatility was punishing firms with dollar-denominated debt. Rather than isolate and stabilize the car division, Kim mobilized the entire group to prop it up, with executives across Daewoo's sprawling empire being ordered to take part in direct sales campaigns, with performance reviews tied to how many vehicles they personally sold, while employees were offered interest-free loans to purchase cars financed internally by other Daewoo affiliates. Even the group's more profitable and strategic divisions, such as Daewoo Heavy Industries and Daewoo Corporation, were diverted from their core functions to rescue the automotive subsidiary, draining working capital and undermining their financial health, with the group's mounting fragility being exacerbated by its reliance on foreign borrowing. Prior to the crisis, Daewoo carried $5.1 billion in foreign currency loans and $1.9 billion in debt to overseas bondholders, but when the won depreciated sharply, the real cost of these obligations more than doubled, and Daewoo's total foreign currency exposure ballooned to an estimated 49 trillion won, while interest payments surged from 3 trillion to over 6 trillion won annually. At the same time, expected revenues from key international contracts failed to materialize, with Libya, for instance, owing Daewoo nearly $3 billion for large-scale infrastructure projects, while Pakistan had yet to pay approximately $1 billion linked to highway development, with these missing payments severely constraining Daewoo's cash flow, leaving it dangerously illiquid. Nevertheless, Daewoo continued to borrow aggressively, and throughout 1998, the group issued 19.7 trillion won in commercial paper and corporate bonds, often at punitive interest rates between 15 and 25%, with the third quarter alone seeing it raise 9.2 trillion won, accounting for over a quarter of all bond issuances in the country. Investment trusts and institutional investors bought heavily, lured by the returns and comforted by the assumption that Daewoo was too important to fail, though these expectations would later prove ruinous, as when Daewoo defaulted, the impact cascaded through the Korean financial system, paralyzing the bond market and deepening the crisis. Eventually, the government moved to halt the contagion, and in July 1998, regulators imposed a 5% cap on commercial paper holdings by any single financial institution, while in October, a similar restriction was applied to corporate bonds, with these measures being designed to reduce concentration risk and curb reckless lending to highly leveraged conglomerates, but also had the immediate effect of strangling Daewoo's access to capital markets. Despite months of discussions with regulators, Daewoo made little effort to reduce its debt exposure or adjust its capital strategy, and when its last funding sources were cut off, the group faced a liquidity crunch it could not escape, with matters being made worse when Kim was hospitalized in November with a cerebral blood clot, leaving a leadership vacuum at a critical moment. Desperate to engineer a recovery, the government proposed a big deal in December 1998, which entailed a corporate swap under which Daewoo would trade Daewoo Electronics for Samsung Motors, with this move being designed to consolidate Korea's struggling auto sector and force Daewoo to focus on its most troubled division. However, amid the proposed swap with Samsung, ugly but long-standing rumours of accounting fraud came to the fore, this practice not being unknown for Daewoo, as even in the early 1980s, judicial investigations concluded that financial manipulation was already underway, with 1981 seeing internal irregularities begin surfacing, although they were neither publicly acknowledged nor scrutinized by regulators or financial institutions. At the same time, South Korea's banking culture encouraged leniency towards opaque financial practices, especially among major chaebols, with credit assessments focusing more on sales volume and asset size rather than actual profitability or cash flow, thus providing companies with a strong incentive to exaggerate financial indicators to secure additional loans, while banks, under the influence of government directives, rarely questioned the health of the country's large conglomerates. In the mid-1970s, Daewoo had initially presented itself as a model of financial transparency, adopting consolidated financial statements earlier than most chaebols in order to gain credibility with foreign investors, with these statements providing a clearer picture of the group's overall financial condition and helped Daewoo secure overseas funding. However, by the mid-1980s, this practice was abruptly abandoned, and the group stopped issuing consolidated accounts altogether, a decision that should have been regarded as a warning sign by auditors, regulators, and institutional lenders, but instead went largely unnoticed, and by March 1995, Daewoo's senior management was receiving quarterly updates on special borrowing, a term used internally to refer to off-the-books financial arrangements that concealed the extent of the company's liabilities. The British Finance Corporation, or BFC, played a pivotal role in Daewoo's offshore financial engineering. This firm, established in 1982 to manage payments related to construction projects in Libya, being based in London and operated under intense secrecy by a small team of 5 executives from Daewoo's financial department. Over time, the BFC's remit expanded to include trading accounts and financial transfers involving multiple Daewoo affiliates, and by 1996, its annual transactions had grown to between $6 and $7 billion, with August 1999 seeing the BFC have authority over 37 offshore accounts with a combined flow of $7.5 billion, which were used to repay $3.4 billion in debt and interest, while diverting $4.1 billion to support failing Daewoo affiliates, with BFC being used to circumvent Korea's foreign exchange controls and hide Daewoo's growing financial vulnerability. One of the most deceptive aspects of the scheme involved Daewoo affiliates with poor credit ratings issuing new shares, which were then purchased by overseas financial institutions under the pretense of equity investment, while in reality, these transactions were backed by separate agreements, obligating more financially stable Daewoo entities to repurchase the shares if they fell below a certain price, essentially converting equity into debt, but without disclosing this transformation on Daewoo's balance sheets. These arrangements allowed Daewoo to secure foreign capital while avoiding the scrutiny and limitations normally imposed on corporate borrowing, with the company's official accounts remaining clean, even as they accumulated billions in hidden obligations. As the financial condition of its foreign operations deteriorated, Daewoo began redirecting receivables from export transactions, or funds that should have been repatriated into its Korean affiliates, into the BFC accounts to service more urgent overseas debt, and by 1997, Daewoo was engaging in large-scale balance sheet manipulation. That year, it understated its assets by 10.1 trillion won, or $6.7 billion, reduced its recorded liabilities by 22.9 trillion won, or $15.3 billion, and overstated its equity by 12.8 trillion won, or $8.53 billion, effectively masking 10.7 trillion won or $7.13 billion in impaired capital, while the following year, the company continued its efforts to protect financial health despite deepening losses. In 1998, assets were further deflated by 0.77 trillion won or $0.55 billion, liabilities by 13.4 trillion won or $9.6 billion, and capital was overstated by 14.2 trillion won or $10 billion, concealing an additional 10.3 trillion won or $7.4 billion in impaired capital, while throughout this period, Daewoo's net debt continued to rise, increasing from 11.8 trillion won or $7.87 billion in 1997 to 12.1 trillion won or $8.64 billion in 1998. Inside Korea, the accounting fraud relied on complex intergroup financial transactions, with the Financial Supervisory Service or FSS later discovering more than 15 trillion won or $12.5 billion in off-balance sheet liabilities, which included 4 trillion won or $3.33 billion in non-performing loans, 3 trillion won or $2.5 billion in fictitious inventory, and 1 trillion won or $0.83 billion in fabricated research and development expenses. Stronger affiliates were used to support weaker ones through asset swaps, in which inflated assets were purchased at above-market prices, transferring wealth internally and preserving the illusion of solvency, while Daewoo also exploited financial firms such as Seoul Investment Trust Management or SITM, which, though not technically a subsidiary, was under Daewoo's control and used up to 38% of its funds in 1998 and 1999 to purchase 2.9 trillion won or $2.42 billion in bonds and commercial paper from financially distressed Daewoo units. To maintain the illusion of operational viability, Daewoo also engaged in direct fraud against Korean banks, forging bills of lading, commercial invoices and packing lists to back fictitious export transactions, with these documents being used to obtain credit by discounting bills of exchange, a practice that banks accepted on face value due to Daewoo's size and perceived credibility, while in many cases, real and fake documents were mixed together to confuse auditors and loan officers, with the courts later acknowledging that the scope and complexity of the forgery made it difficult for bank staff to detect the deception. Despite the extensive records left behind, investigators were unable to account for approximately $753 million held within the BFC's network of offshore accounts, with speculation long surrounding the fate of this sum, with some analysts believing that it may have been used to finance political lobbying activities, while others argue it was siphoned off by top executives for personal use. One transfer of $44.3 million to a Hong Kong shell company, which acted as a proxy for Chairman Woo Choong Kim, was confirmed, and in 2006, a South Korean court found that a special account known as KC or King of Chairmen within the BFC network had indeed been used to fund the personal expenses of Kim and his family. Nevertheless, the operation of BFC accounts breached several key South Korean laws, with the period between 1996 and 1999 seeing Daewoo executives fail to report or consolidate 5 to 8 trillion won, or between $4.17 and $6.7 billion, in off-balance sheet liabilities annually, violating the External Audit Act and the Special Economic Crimes Aggravated Punishment Act, as well as breaching laws prohibiting the concealment of personal assets overseas. Daewoo's stated defense that these funds were only used to repay corporate debts would be rejected by the courts, which ruled that the law required full disclosure irrespective of intent, while additionally, Daewoo transferred funds abroad without approval from the Ministry of Finance and Economy in violation of the Foreign Currency Management Act, and to conceal these transactions, executives falsified documents to make it appear that these payments were for legitimate imports, even though the receiving firms were paper companies secretly controlled by Daewoo. According to the final audit by the Securities and Futures Commission in September 2000, Daewoo had inflated its reported assets by 22.9 trillion won, or $19.1 billion, and was responsible for 14.6 trillion won, or $12.2 billion of this amount, with Daewoo Motor and Daewoo Electronics together accounting for an additional 8.4 trillion won, or $7 billion, which saw these three companies combined represent 90% of the group's impaired capital. Notably, the SFC report omitted nearly 20 trillion won, or $16.7 billion in accounting fraud identified in an earlier government audit in 1999, citing an overly strict application of accounting standards in the preliminary report, with this decision remaining unexplained and controversial, raising further questions to regulatory complicity or oversight failure. Daewoo's accounting fraud was unparalleled in Korean corporate history, and while other chaebols suffered from systemic financial opacity, Daewoo's deceit stood out due to the magnitude of the manipulated figures, the complexity of its schemes, and the breadth of its concealment, with Kim being directly at the heart of the operation, and had direct oversight and likely participation in the fraud. With the revelation of the fraud, the proposed stock swap with Samsung collapsed, with Samsung, reportedly tipped off by a disgruntled former employee, discovering over 4 trillion won in suspected fraud at Daewoo Electronics, with trust between the two chaebols breaking down, and the proposed merger was abandoned. At the end of December, Daewoo entered a formal restructuring agreement with its creditors, pledging to reduce its 51 affiliates to 10 core companies focused on trade, construction, finance, heavy industry and automobiles, though these efforts were belated and largely symbolic, while in February 1999, Kim was elected chairman of the Federation of Korean Industries, a move seen as an attempt to shore up his political standing. In July 1999, Kim made a final attempt to save his empire when he publicly pledged to relinquish 1.3 trillion won of his personal equity into Daewoo companies and offered a new restructuring plan that would retain Daewoo Motor while liquidating or selling off the rest, while in exchange, he negotiated more than 10 trillion won in additional assets, including stock and real estate, to support the effort. The Financial Supervisory Service approved a 6-month rollover of 6 trillion won in short-term debt and authorized 4 trillion won in new loans, but rather than revitalize operations, a substantial portion of this capital was reportedly used to cover unpaid wages and other short-term liabilities, and the rescue attempt, while large in scale, failed to stop the bleeding. In August 1999, 12 of Daewoo's principal companies entered court-led workout programs, with November 1st seeing the CEOs of all groups affiliated resign en masse, and Kim formally stepped down from the board on November 23rd, after which he fled South Korea days later, beginning a lengthy period of exile overseas, the group, between 1997 and 1999, having issued nearly 20 trillion won in debt and received more than 10 trillion won in bank loans, an extraordinary capital infusion that failed to stabilize the business. Amid the subsequent legal fallout of Daewoo's collapse, it was revealed that between 1997 and 1998, at the height of the Asian financial crisis, Kim allegedly ordered senior executives to commit accounting fraud, with courts later finding that Kim issued direct instructions which executives followed without question, with many of these managers defending themselves during criminal trials by claiming they merely obeyed the chairman's orders and did not personally profit from the fraud, though these were rejected by the court. Boards of directors, representative directors and statutory auditors shared responsibility for Daewoo's collapse, as they did not act as fiduciaries or internal counterweights, but instead held merely ceremonial roles when it came to board functions, while official board meetings were rarely held, instead comprising fabricated minutes by the chairman's office, which were rubber-stamped with the directors' personal seals held by the planning departments. Directors were frequently appointed through the chairman's office rather than shareholder meetings, and there was little to no distinction between officers and directors, thus blurring oversight and execution, while non-executive outside directors were not appointed until 1998, and even then their roles remained limited. Shareholder litigation and derivative actions were virtually non-existent until 1997, meaning directors operated without fear of accountability, while director and officer liability insurance did not exist, and legal standards for fiduciary duties remained largely theoretical. Kim's extensive reliance on alumni from Kyungi High School further entrenched a hierarchy within the firm, with this network, combined with Korea's Confucian culture of deference to seniors, making internal dissent unlikely, and by the late 1980s and early 1990s, senior executives who could have acted as a check on Kim's authority had retired, leaving behind younger, more pliant successors. Employees and labour unions likewise failed to act as internal monitors, and although Daewoo had employment stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, average holdings were minimal at just 0.61% at the end of 1997, while the ESOPs were dominated by company insiders, and plan participants rarely exercised their voting rights, with labour unions prioritising wage and job security over governance, even as they engaged in bitter, frequent strikes. Korea's one-tiered board structure did not provide formal representation for employees, and whistleblowing was virtually non-existent due to cultural taboos and a lack of legal protection before 2002, while shareholders, both domestic and foreign, remained overwhelmingly passive, with institutional investors only being able to vote through shadow voting, and high minimum shareholding requirements made shareholder rights difficult to exercise. Companies colluded to hold annual meetings simultaneously to prevent shareholder engagement, and shareholder meetings, when held, were short, heavily scripted, and allowed no room for scrutiny, while even after revelations such as the scandal involving 140 billion won in bribes to former presidents, no shareholder action was taken, with the prevailing mentality following the Wall Street rule of sell and move on. It was only after the conglomerate's collapse that shareholder activism gained traction, and in 1999, the People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, or PSPD, filed a landmark civil lawsuit against Kim and other executives, with 2002 seeing a Seoul District Court deliver a civil judgment against former managers and auditors for releasing false financial statements. But despite these rulings marking a turning point, courts also held shareholders partially liable for failing to adequately assess risks or challenge misconduct. Between 1986 and 1988, early indicators of Daewoo's financial opacity were already evident, yet few paid them serious attention, with the Korea Bankers Association introducing a consolidated financial information system during this period, which provided a mechanism for monitoring corporate borrowings, within which a glaring discrepancy emerged in Daewoo's reported debt levels. While Daewoo publicly claimed its total borrowings from domestic financial institutions stood at approximately 5 trillion won, the system revealed the actual figure was closer to 8 trillion won, with this 3 trillion won discrepancy normally having raised warnings for regulators, lenders and market analysts, suggesting that Daewoo was already manipulating its financial disclosures to appear more stable and less leveraged than it truly was. By 1988, the international media had begun to question the group's aggressive expansion and opaque financing strategies, with the New York Times, for example, reporting on Daewoo's rapid and unrestrained capital-raising efforts, highlighting over $1 billion secured both domestically and through Eurobond markets in London, though despite such concerns, there was no significant reaction from Korean regulators or investors, and Daewoo continued to enjoy the trust of markets and policymakers. In 1994, Kim was convicted of paying a 200 million won bribe to a government official connected to an atomic power plant contract, with the court handing him a suspended prison sentence, which became emblematic of the leniency typically extended to chaebol leaders at the time. Though this conviction did little to diminish his influence, and he was later pardoned by presidential decree as an act that reinforced a culture of impunity for corporate elites. Just 2 years later, in 1996, internal dissent emerged within Sangtong Accounting, one of Daewoo's external auditors, with some auditors reportedly discussing exposing fraudulent accounting practices within the company, but their concerns never reached the public, though it is unclear whether this was suppressed internally for fear of retaliation or due to regulatory inertia. In 1997, 3 Daewoo executives were found guilty of deceiving Korea First Bank into issuing a $150 million letter of credit, and despite this substantial amount and the clear evidence of fraudulent intent, the sentences were lenient, ranging from 2.5 to 3 years in prison, and ultimately failed to serve as an effective deterrent, while in the same year, Daewoo was at the center of a broader lending crisis, when foreign banks, along with over 140 domestic banks, extended credit totaling over $50 billion to Daewoo affiliates, much of which was based on dubious financial information. Between 1997 and 1998, Daewoo's expansion continued unchecked, with investment banks aggressively underwriting its bonds and commercial paper, even as the Asian financial crisis deepened, while analysts and credit agencies failed to raise concerns, and in June 1998, Credit Suisse First Boston issued a report highlighting Daewoo's unsustainable level of debt, low profitability, and exposure through cross-affiliate guarantees, describing Daewoo as the most leveraged of the major chaebols. In October 1998, Nomura Securities released a much stronger critique, titled Alarm Bells Are Ringing, which openly questioned Daewoo's viability and suggested it could not survive without structural reforms and drastic deleveraging. Though regardless, the Korean Ministry of Finance publicly refuted these claims, insisting Daewoo had no liquidity crisis, with the state continuing to support Daewoo's capital-raising efforts and did not intervene meaningfully until the end of the year. Meanwhile, the Financial Supervisory Service, tasked with overseeing corporate financial health, conducted general audit reviews of Daewoo Corp and Daewoo Telecom in 1997 and 1998, with these audits revealing underreported assets and liabilities, including over 290 billion won in off-balance sheet obligations. But despite uncovering material misstatements, the FSS merely requested corrections and did not escalate the findings to criminal investigation. Then, in early 1999, internal whistleblowers alerted the FSS to what they estimated to be over 30 trillion won in fraudulent transactions at Daewoo, but the agency failed to act, maintaining its passive stance even in the face of overwhelming evidence. By March and April 1999, with pressure mounting, regulatory authorities suspended the accounting firms of Chong-un and Sangtong, with Chong-un receiving a 1-month suspension from taking on new clients, while Sangtong was suspended for a full year, with these being the most severe penalties ever imposed on Korean audit firms at the time, and both companies soon collapsed, though by this point the damage had already been done. In July 1999, Daewoo's financial structure began to unravel, with international credit rating agencies, including Standard & Poor's and Fitch, belatedly downgrading Daewoo's debt to CCC, signalizing that default was imminent, while Fitch also removed Daewoo Corp from its rating alert positive list, but these actions, though significant, came too late to protect investors or limit the contagion. By December 1999, a special forensic audit team under the FSS began an exhaustive audit of 12 Daewoo affiliates, with their findings prompting the Securities and Futures Commission to refer 21 Daewoo executives and 4 senior accountants for criminal prosecution, marking the first time that Korean regulators and courts moved decisively against both corporate officers and their external auditors in a major accounting fraud case. On July 31, 2001, the Korea Export Insurance Corporation secured a 250 billion won civil judgment against Woo Choong Kim based on his personal guarantees on defaulted bank loans to Daewoo, with this judgment being one of the largest ever issued in Korean civil litigation history, while in November 2003, Woori Bank won a separate 1.4 billion won lawsuit against 2 executives of Daewoo Electronics who had misrepresented financial statements that led to over 36 billion won in losses. The court held the directors liable under Article 401 of the Korean Commercial Code, reinforcing the principle of third-party liability, and a further ruling in November 2004 found 5 Daewoo Motor executives liable for 6 billion won in damages related to fraudulent loan practices, assigning most of the blame, up to 80%, to the bank involved due to its negligent due diligence. In January 2005, courts convicted An Kwon & Co., one of Daewoo's main auditing firms, for its role in approving manipulated financial statements, with the head of the firm receiving a suspended sentence and the firm itself being fined, this decision being significant as it extended legal accountability to the professional intermediaries who enabled Daewoo's deception. At the same time, the Korea Deposit Insurance Corporation, which had acquired failed bank assets using public funds, initiated civil suits targeting 35 accounts and 49 former Daewoo executives, estimating damages from their actions that exceeded 4.26 trillion won, with these lawsuits representing an unprecedented wave of public accountability in Korean corporate governance. In April 2005, a High Court ruled that shares previously assumed to be part of Kim's hidden assets actually belonged to his daughter, with this ruling undermining KDIC's efforts to recover assets and highlighted the difficulties of unwinding complex asset concealment schemes, while around this time, the courts imposed staggering restitution orders against several Daewoo executives, with Kim and others facing joint and several liability for up to 23 trillion won, amounts that far exceeded any previous penalties imposed in South Korea's corporate history. Despite the scale of the fraud and the financial ruin it caused, only one Daewoo executive ultimately served prison time, with most receiving suspended sentences, and in December 2002, President Kim Dae-jung issued pardons to 8 of the convicted executives, with the judiciary justifying the leniency on the grounds that the executives had not personally enriched themselves and had acted under a corporate culture demanding absolute loyalty to Kim, though these decisions rekindled criticism about elite impunity and selective enforcement. Finally, on June 14, 2005, after evading a global Interpol arrest warrant, Kim would return to South Korea to face justice, and was apprehended the moment he arrived back in Seoul, with May 2006 seeing him sentenced to 10 years in prison for embezzlement and accounting fraud, alongside the seizure of 21 trillion won or $22 billion of his fortune, and a fine of an additional 10 million won or $10,000. Kim, amid his failing health, would ultimately have his sentence reduced to 8.5 years, before being pardoned by President Roh Moo-hyun on December 30, 2007, as part of the South Korean tradition for presidents to hand out pardons for the new year, with Kim eventually passing away 10 days before his 83rd birthday on December 9, 2019. To summarize, the collapse of Daewoo was not merely the result of one company's internal failings, but the culmination of systemic breakdowns across all levels of oversight, with commercial banks lending irresponsibly under the assumption of government backing, accounting firms compromising their integrity under client pressure, investment banks underwriting risky securities without adequate due diligence, credit rating agencies moving slowly and often reacting after the market has already shifted, and regulators, prosecutors and courts being either paralyzed or complicit until the damage was irreversible. Daewoo's implosion exposed the fragility of Korea's corporate governance system and the collective negligence of institutions charged with safeguarding market integrity, and would ultimately serve as both a cautionary tale of a catalyst for reform, prompting legal and institutional change that sought to reduce real accountability into a system that had long tolerated corporate impunity.